Who really carved the Sphinx? That question, like a shadow, has followed humanity for many thousands of years, and to this day, we have no definitive answer. Imagine for a moment this gigantic figure, carved from a single rock, resting on the Giza Plateau under the blazing Egyptian sun. Its face looks eastward, toward where each morning begins a new cycle, and in that mute gaze, there is an intentional, almost sacred silence. It has kept its riddles so long that ordinary sense of time pales beside it. And here is what particularly troubles those who try to understand this monument. Perhaps what we were taught is not so much history as a convenient version of history. For many years, we were told that the Great Sphinx was created roughly 4,500 years ago by order of Pharaoh Khafre, ruler of the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt. We were told that the face on the monument is a portrait of the pharaoh himself, and the lion's body a symbol of royal authority and divine power. This neat, attractive version fits easily into textbooks and museum displays. It is convenient and comprehensible. Geologists studying the surface of the Sphinx find traces whose nature and origin do not fit the accepted chronology. Astronomers point to star maps and celestial markers that, in their view, do not match the official data. Researchers of ancient texts encounter mentions of the Sphinx in sources produced long before Khafre's time. The deeper we dive into this mystery, the clearer the sense becomes. Before us may lie something far more ancient and enigmatic than. Today, we will examine 5 theories about the origin of the Sphinx, each of which could radically change our ideas about deep antiquity. We will look at traces of water erosion, an explanation that geologists cannot accept without reservations. We will turn our gaze to the sky and trace which stars and constellations the Sphinx may have faced thousands of years ago. We will delve into ancient myths and legends that may preserve fragments of lost truth. And finally, we will consider technologies supposedly non-existent in that era, but which hint at a different level of craftsmanship. As we follow these lines of inquiry, the picture will become more layered, and doubt will stop being merely a flicker. It will become the basis for new questions. And finally, let us pose the boldest question. What if the Sphinx is not a creation of human hands at all? It is a provocative thought that breaks familiar assumptions and demands a sober look at the facts. Let us consider what is known without conjecture. The Great Sphinx of Giza is recognized as the largest monolithic statue of the ancient world. Its length is approximately 73 meters. Its height approaches 20 meters. The statue is carved from a limestone mass that is part of the Giza Plateau, and for many centuries it lay buried in sand, almost up to its shoulders, until archaeologists finally cleared it completely only in the 20th century. Official Egyptology attributes the creation of the Sphinx to the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, roughly around 2500 BCE. This dating rests on several arguments. First, the proximity. In addition, some see a resemblance between the Sphinx's facial features and depictions of Khafre. At first glance, these arguments appear logical and convincing. However, serious questions arise along this line of reasoning. The most striking and troubling inconsistency is that there is not a single ancient Egyptian inscription that explicitly states Khafre built the Sphinx. Not one. In a civilization that meticulously recorded major events on the walls of temples and in tombs, filling spaces with hieroglyphs in praise of its rulers. This fact alone prompts a return to the primary evidence and a reassessment of established interpretations. When the official version relies on indirect signs and direct evidence is lacking, it is reasonable to retain some doubt and keep the question open for further research. Pharaohs always strove to outdo one another in the splendor of their constructions. Erecting a colossal statue would have been not merely an achievement for a ruler. It would have been a victory he would have proclaimed everywhere, and with pride. But in the case of the Sphinx, the odd thing is this. In sources from the time of Khafre's supposed reign, there are no loud declarations and no clear testimonies confirming that he was the creator of this gigantic monument. On the contrary, the historical record is silent. The only ancient text that in some degree links the Sphinx with a pharaoh's name is the so-called Dream Stele, erected between the monument's forepaws by Thut. The text of the stele recounts that the young Thutmose fell asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx after a hunt. In his dream, the god Horemakhet, the spirit, as the ancients believed, embodied in the statue, appeared to him. The god promised the youth the royal throne in exchange for clearing the Sphinx of the sand that by that time had almost completely engulfed the monument. The young claimant fulfilled the promise and later became pharaoh. There is damage on the slab where, according to some researchers, Khafre's name may have stood. However, even allowing for that, the text of the stele does not directly assert that Khafre created the Sphinx. The inscription merely mentions his name in a context whose interpretation still provokes debate among scholars. It is precisely this strained silence surrounding the monument's origin that constitutes the first serious crack in the accepted version. If Khafre really was the creator of the Sphinx, why is there not a single unequivocal piece of evidence to prove it? Why is the greatest of the ancient statues surrounded by so many uncertainties and gaps? Some researchers answer these questions simply. Perhaps Khafre did not build the Sphinx from scratch. The version is that he may only have carried out a restoration, repaired the monument, and perhaps given it a new face, while the Sphinx itself existed long before his time. If this hypothesis is correct, serious and still unresolved questions open up for history and archaeology about the true age and origin of the statue. We will now consider one of the most debated alternative concepts, the first of 5 theories that have attracted wide attention in academic circles over the past decades. This is the theory of water erosion, proposed by geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University in the early 1990s. Schoch was not a sensationalist and was not among the conspiracy-minded. He remains a respected specialist in geology and geophysics. When Schoch first arrived on the Giza Plateau, he did not intend to rewrite history. His aim was modest and scientific, to apply the tested methods of his discipline to the study of the ancient monument. What met his eye during the work surprised even him. Schoch focused on the character of the erosion visible on the Sphinx's body and on the walls of the pit in which it rests. Official science explained those traces by wind and sand, a logical assumption for a monument standing in the desert for millennia. But Schoch saw something quite different. The relief of the limestone surface, deep vertical grooves, wavy and rounded shapes, corresponds to the type of weathering that geologists unequivocally associate with the action of water, not with wind or sand. Those grooves in his observation could only have formed from years of water running over the rock. By itself, such an observation would not have been revolutionary if not for one key fact. The Giza area has seen no significant rainfall in the past 5,000 years. The climate became arid roughly 1,000 years before Khafre's supposed reign. Therefore, for water erosion to have left such deep marks, the Sphinx must have stood in an era when the Giza Plateau received abundant rains, and that inevitably pushes the monument much further back in time than is commonly believed. According to Schoch's calculations, based on limestone weathering rates and climatic data for North Africa, the Sphinx's age should be at least 7,000 years, possibly much more. Other researchers, following the same logic, push its age even further, to 10 or even 12,000 years. Such a shift in the time frame brings us back to the end of the last ice age, when the Sahara was a flourishing savanna and the lands that are now desert received enough rainfall to support rich vegetation and numerous rivers. Imagine the scene for a moment. 12,000 years ago, the pyramids did not yet exist. Grass covered the Giza Plateau, about 100 animals grazed on the meadows, streams babbled, and in the midst of this living landscape, the Sphinx already stood. The Sphinx turned out to be so ancient that its age confounds even our notions of the corresponding era. Was this monument created by people of whom we know almost nothing? Or was it carved in an even more remote age that we can scarcely imagine? Official Egyptology, of course, rejected Schoch's conclusions and did not accept his interpretation of the markings on the monument's body. Critics pointed to alternative causes of the erosion: salts seeping through the limestone, the influence of groundwater, and short but intense downpours that occasionally sweep across the desert. Schoch and his supporters systematically answered each such objection. They showed that salt-induced erosion produces a different, looser, and more irregular surface pattern. They argued that groundwater simply could not have risen high enough to explain the signs of degradation on the upper parts of the enclosure, where erosion is especially pronounced. Moreover, they compared other monuments on the Giza Plateau, built in the Old Kingdom period, which display characteristic wind erosion and look entirely different from the Sphinx. The debate continues to this day. If Schoch's arguments were clearly wrong, they would have been refuted and forgotten long ago. But that has not happened. The geological theory explaining the erosion as the result of water remains one of the most serious problems for the accepted dating of the Sphinx, like a deep-seated wound in the body of Egyptology that cannot be easily dismissed. Let us go a step further and imagine for a moment that Schoch is right, and the Sphinx was indeed created 7, 10, or 12,000 years ago. What would that mean for our picture of the past? According to the conventional chronology, people at that time had not yet built cities. They lived in small bands of hunter-gatherers, used stone tools, and had no writing. The idea that such a society could, if the watermarks on the Sphinx are genuine, our ideas about the development of human civilization require serious revision and rethinking. Perhaps at the dawn of history, there existed a more advanced culture, of which almost nothing has reached us. Imagine a culture capable of sculpting enormous statues and cutting through rock, versed in astronomy and mathematics, and producing works of art and engineering that endured for millennia. And then that civilization vanished, as if destroyed by some catastrophe. Its memory survived only in myths and legends that we now tend to dismiss as fairy tales. Plato wrote about Atlantis, an island swallowed by the sea roughly 12,000 years ago. Ancient Indian texts tell of civilizations crushed by flood and fire. Legends of a great deluge appear among virtually every people on Earth. What if there is a grain of truth hidden in these tales? What if one of the oldest monuments on our planet, the Sphinx, is the last witness of that lost world? This idea naturally leads into another hypothesis, closely related to the first and complementing the geological evidence with an astronomical measurement. I am speaking of the so-called theory of stellar correlation developed by Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock in their famous mid-1990s book, The Mystery of the Sphinx. According to this, Orion was of enormous importance to the ancient Egyptians. They called it Sahu and identified it with the god Osiris, lord of the afterlife. From this comes the logical thought that the builders may have deliberately arranged their structures to reflect this sacred celestial image. However, on closer inspection, an important question arises. The Earth's axis slowly precesses, and the positions of the stars relative to the horizon change over time. A full cycle of this precession takes about 26,000 years. During it, constellations rise and fall. Bauval and Hancock used computer modeling to recreate the appearance of the sky in the distant past and discovered a remarkable coincidence. The layout of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau turned out to be an exact reproduction of the position of Orion's belt, but not in the era when these monuments are usually assumed to have been built, rather much earlier. The perfect match occurs at roughly 10,450 BCE, that is, more than 12,000 years ago. It was at that time that Orion's belt reached the lowest point of its precessional cycle, and its position in the sky was strikingly consonant with the arrangement of the three pyramids on the ground. But how does the Sphinx fit into this picture? Here the theory becomes even more intriguing. The Sphinx faces due east, toward the point where the sun rises on the equinoxes. The question is, what could be seen in the morning sky in that distant epoch? Bauval and Hancock checked this and found that on the morning of the spring equinox in 10,450 BCE, the gaze of the Sphinx coincided with the rising of the constellation Leo. Leo is precisely the figure echoed in the body of the Sphinx. Coincidence? Perhaps, but the coincidence seems too precise to be easily dismissed. Astronomers and historians call such a span the Age of Leo. Each such age lasts roughly 2,160 years, and the Age of Leo, by calculation, extended approximately from 10,950 BCE to 8,790 BCE. If the Sphinx was erected in that era, its leonine form acquires not just an artistic, but a distinctly astronomical significance. Thus, the Sphinx may have served less as an ordinary statue and more as a gigantic temporal marker, indicating a specific epoch in a grand celestial cycle. This interpretation brings together geological observations and stellar correlation. Traces of water erosion on the monument indicate that Egypt received significant precipitation at least until the 5th millennium BCE, whereas the stellar correlation points to an even earlier date, approximately 10,450 BCE. Both lines of evidence converge on one point. The Sphinx may turn out to be significantly older than is commonly believed. Of course, the hypothesis has its critics. They note that the correspondence of the pyramids to Orion's belt is not perfect. The angles and distances between the objects do not. Critics ask a perfectly reasonable question. If the builders aimed for astronomical precision, why would they have allowed such discrepancies? Proponents of these hypotheses explicitly acknowledge that there is no direct evidence the ancient Egyptians knew about the precession of the Earth's axis. At the same time, some researchers suggest that notions of such cycles could have been encoded in their myths, rituals, and stone monuments. Debates around this idea continue, and no unified scientific consensus has yet been reached. Nevertheless, the very thought that the Giza complex might have been conceived as a single astronomical project 12,000 years ago captures the imagination and prompts a re-examination of what we may have overlooked. Turning to the third type of evidence, often ignored by official science, we should pay attention to ancient texts and legends, that collective human memory passed down from generation to generation long before widespread writing emerged. These traditions and ritual narratives often serve as repositories of knowledge about the past, and the forms of such preservation could vary widely, from mythic imagery to ceremonial rites. The ancient Egyptians left us an extensive literary heritage, myths, chronicles, and the so-called king lists, which enumerate the rulers of the land from the earliest times. One of the most notable sources, this papyrus is badly damaged and many of its fragments are lost. Yet the surviving pieces of text still paint a remarkable picture. According to the Turin Papyrus, before the arrival of human pharaohs, Egypt was ruled by gods, and then by demigods known as the followers of Horus, or Shemsu-Hor. The reign of these divine and semi-divine kings, the text claims, stretched over tens of thousands of years and reaches back to depths of time that are hard to imagine. Modern historians generally treat this part of the papyrus as mythological prehistory, lacking direct historical reliability. In their view, the ancient Egyptians, but a reasonable question arises. Might modern scholarship be mistaken in completely rejecting these traditions? Perhaps beneath the layers of myth lies a memory of a civilization that actually existed on Egypt. It concerns a civilization that, according to ancient testimony, created the Sphinx and other monuments later adopted and interpreted by dynastic Egypt. A similar version is preserved in the works of the historian Manetho, an Egyptian priest of the 3rd century BCE, who wrote the history of Egypt in Greek for the Hellenistic rulers. His work has not survived in full, but later authors quote passages from it, and it is through these fragments that we know his views on the country's early history. Manetho described in detail the eras of gods and demigods that preceded the human dynasties. According to his chronology, the rule of the gods lasted 13,900 years. Then, he said, 12 gods ruled for another 11,985 years. After that came the era of demigods, which lasted 1,817 years. Only then, according to Manetho, does the sequence of human pharaohs begin. If one adds these intervals and counts them back from the start of the first dynasty, the resulting date lies more than 20,000 years in the past. Such a chronology seems incredible, and most modern scholars tend to treat these numbers as the fantasies of an ancient writer. Nevertheless, it is noteworthy that the time frames given in the mythological sources broadly echo some geological data and astronomical datings discussed in other studies. This suggests that the ancient Egyptians may have had a deeper knowledge of their own past than is commonly assumed. Another important document in this context is the so-called Inventory Stele, discovered by the French Egyptologist Auguste Mariette in the 19th. A small limestone stele contains a text that mentions the Sphinx and claims that it existed even before the reign of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid and predecessor of Khafre. According to the text, Khufu allegedly found the Sphinx damaged and buried in sand and ordered it to be restored. This directly contradicts the generally accepted view that the Sphinx was created by Khafre, son of Khufu. Official Egyptology typically rejects the Inventory Stele, considering it either a later forgery or, at best, a religious text composed in the era of the 26th dynasty, almost 2,000 years after the Sphinx. Critics point to stylistic features of the text that, in their view, do not match the Old Kingdom, as well as grammatical forms typical of later periods of Egyptian history. They insist that the Inventory Stele was compiled by priests. There may be some truth to this, and such suspicions cannot be ignored. Nevertheless, it is worth emphasizing the following. Even if the Inventory Stele is indeed a late copy or a reworked text, it may well preserve a trace of a much older tradition passed down through generations. The priests of the 26th dynasty were famed for their fascination with antiquities and their efforts to revive and embellish former glories. They studied ancient texts and monuments closely, systematized information about past centuries, and often, for that reason, one cannot dismiss out of hand their claims that the Sphinx preceded the pyramids. It is possible that behind those words lay sources that have simply not survived to us. We will never be certain of that, but complete dismissal of such testimony would be rash and unjustified. Another side of the question is the evidence of Greek and Roman authors. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, left us a detailed description of the Giza pyramids, yet remarkably scarcely mentioned the Sphinx. This is puzzling, given the statue's monumental size and Herodotus's own curiosity. Such a lacuna in his account seems odd. Scholars have proposed several explanations. Some believe that others think that the relevant fragment of Herodotus's work may have been lost in transmission. A third theory is that Herodotus simply did not mention the Sphinx because his main informants, the Egyptian priests, themselves did not know who or for them, the Sphinx was an enigma whose roots plunged into the impenetrable darkness of remote ages. Pliny the Elder, the 1st century Roman naturalist, also mentioned, according to him, the locals considered the Sphinx the tomb of a certain king named Armais. Who this Armais was remains an open question. The name does not correspond to any known Egyptian pharaoh. We do not have precise information. Nevertheless, the very existence of such a tradition clearly shows that even in deep antiquity, the origin of the Sphinx was shrouded in mist and uncertainty. Medieval Arab historians, writing after the Muslim conquest of Egypt, also preserved curious legends about the ancient statue. They called it Abu al-Hawl, father of terror, and attributed it to antediluvian times. In a number of Arab sources, the Sphinx is described as a creation that appeared before the Great Flood, recounted in the Quran and the Bible, and is viewed as a monument to a civilization once destroyed by divine wrath. Other legends ascribe to the Sphinx connections with magical practices and secret knowledge, claiming that chambers hiding the wisdom of the ancients lie beneath the monument. Interestingly, modern research has partly confirmed the suggestions of voids in the base and around the Sphinx. In the 1990s, a Japanese expedition led by Professor Yoshimura conducted seismic surveys on the Giza Plateau and recorded anomalies hinting at the possible existence of underground chambers. Later Egyptian authorities confirmed the presence of at least one tunnel under the statue's body, but its purpose and what it might contain remain unknown. The question arises, are the Arab legends of hidden rooms an echo of real knowledge passed? Let us now turn to the fourth theory, which focuses on the technological aspects of the Sphinx's construction and poses the problem of assessing the capabilities of ancient craftsmen. This version does not necessarily challenge the accepted chronological framework, but it insistently prompts us to consider how advanced the technological techniques of the ancient world were and whether we are overlooking something important in our attempts to understand. The Sphinx is carved directly out of solid rock, and that fact alone already looks like an engineering achievement. The builder faced a difficult task, To carve a figure 73 meters long and 20 meters high out of a limestone plateau, removing roughly 1,000 tons of rock while preserving exact proportions and fine details. It seems no easy feat. No electrical equipment, no steel, no explosives. Only copper tools, stone hammers, sand for polishing, and many hands. How could such work be accomplished under those conditions? According to the official account, the ancient Egyptians used simple but well-developed methods: copper chisels to remove large slabs, stone hammers for finer work, and a mixture of sand and water as an abrasive to smooth surfaces and achieve the desired form. They worked slowly and methodically, passing skills from generation to generation and constantly refining their technique. This explanation seems reasonable and supports the view that their engineers and craftsmen were talented and skilled. Nevertheless, a detailed analysis raises legitimate questions. Copper is a relatively soft metal, and tools made from it lose their edge quite quickly when working stone. Practical tests show that carving such a colossal statue would have required an enormous number of copper tools, which would inevitably have needed. In the era of the Old Kingdom, copper was a valuable resource, mined in the Sinai Desert and brought in from distant regions. Using such large quantities of copper for a single sculpture would have been prohibitively expensive. There is another aspect that puzzles scholars. Some details of the Sphinx display a level of fine finishing that is hard to explain solely by primitive tools. Look at the ears, the smooth curves of the Nemes headdress, the symmetry of the facial features. These elements demand significant precision and neatness, not always achievable with only hammer and chisel. Of course, one can argue that we underestimate the skill of ancient stonecutters, and that observation is valid. However, it does not remove all questions and leaves room for further study. Another mystery concerns the proportions of the Sphinx. This is a topic that requires separate attention and more detailed examination. If one studies the silhouette of the Great Sphinx closely, this mismatch is especially noticeable if the figures compared with other Egyptian depictions of sphinxes, where proportions are generally more harmonious and natural. One of the most pragmatic explanations for this anomaly is that the head did not. According to one theory, the Sphinx originally had a lion's head, matching its powerful torso. Only later, in the Pharaonic era, was the stone image reworked and given human features. Such a reconstruction of the hypothesis clarifies several observations at once. First, it removes the question of the head's disproportion. The small human visage easily becomes the result of a later alteration, rather than the original intent. Second, it explains why the Sphinx's face has, in relative terms, been better preserved than its body. If the facial part was reworked or replaced later, it had less time to suffer erosive And finally, it helps to understand why it is so difficult to definitively identify whom the face depicts. In the reworking, the original features could have been lost, erased, or altered. Some researchers have gone further and proposed bolder suggestions that the original image may not have been a lion at all. The author of the book The Sphinx Mystery, Robert Temple, suggests that the statue may originally have represented. If one mentally replaces the current human head with a canine one, the contours of the torso and the proportions do indeed look much more coherent. Nevertheless, this version is interesting mainly as a hypothesis. It currently lacks direct archaeological. Finally, there is the most radical and controversial interpretation of this puzzle, which asserts that the Sphinx may not have been created by humans at all, but by some other form of intelligence. Before dismissing this idea as science fiction, it is worth at least broadly understanding the logic of its proponents. Throughout history, in many cultures around the world, people preserved accounts of beings who descended from the heavens, bringing knowledge and the gifts of civilization. Supporters of the unusual version read such traditions as possible fragments of memory, of contacts with other intelligences, and view giant stone monuments like the Sphinx as potential traces of such interactions. This last theory, like the hypotheses that precede it, provokes lively debate and remains a subject of controversy. Its adherents point to a number of interpretations of legends and formal inconsistencies, while critics emphasize the absence of incontrovertible evidence. Since ancient times, peoples around the world have produced narratives about beings sent from the heavens, who took part in the creation or upbringing of humanity. The Sumerians, for example, believed in the Anunnaki, celestial beings regarded as co-founders of humankind. Egyptian myths feature gods such as Osiris and Thoth, who are credited with imparting to humans the skills of agriculture, writing, and other crafts and knowledge. Greek traditions preserve memories of the Titans and the Olympian gods, and ancient Indian texts mention Vimanas, flying chariots used by the deities. Biblical stories include the Nephilim, giants said to have arisen from contacts between the sons of God and human women. Supporters of the so-called ancient astronaut theory, an idea made widely known by authors such as Erich von Däniken and Zecharia Sitchin, believe that all these, according to their view, aliens visited Earth in the distant past, made contact with then essentially primitive communities, and left behind material traces, monumental structures, evidence of technical skill, and distinctive cultural artifacts. Among the most discussed pieces of evidence, proponents cite the Sphinx. Its obscure origin, disputed age, and imposing scale, they argue, set it apart from other monuments and make the presence of a non-human intelligence plausible. They also point to the colossal complexity of the Giza pyramids, their precise astronomical orientation, and ancient Egyptian texts that speak of gods ruling the land before the appearance of human kings. Added to this are ancient depictions of beings with unusual proportions, elongated skulls, large eyes, and unfamiliar bodies, which are interpreted as portraits of extraterrestrials. Official science, however, rejects such radical interpretations. Critics emphasize that the ancient astronaut theory rests on mistaken assumptions about the alleged total inability of ancient peoples to carry out complex engineering, on incorrect interpretations of archaeological data, and on an excessively literal reading of mythological texts. They are confident that everything that now seems mysterious about the ancient world can be explained by ordinary human ingenuity, skill, and years of hard labor, without invoking hypotheses about intervention by extraterrestrial civilizations. And there is some truth to that. Humanity is indeed capable of astonishing achievements, and often there is no need to look for supernatural explanations where ordinary earthly causes suffice. Nevertheless, even when rejecting the alien hypothesis, the question remains acute. Who, then, built the Sphinx? If not Khafre, then who? If not the ancient Egyptians of the 4th dynasty, what civilization stood behind this monument? We inevitably return to the original riddle, for which there is no definitive answer yet. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between official history and the radical hypotheses. One cannot rule out that there once existed in Egypt an older culture predating the dynastic state, a civilization capable of erecting the Sphinx and other monumental works, which then vanished, leaving only stone sentinels and vague traditions. Such a culture need not have been extraterrestrial or superhuman. It could have been entirely terrestrial, simply much older than what we are accustomed to. Recall the example of the discovery of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a megalithic complex dated to the 10th millennium BCE. This discovery turned out to be 6,000 years older than Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids, and seriously undermined previous scientific views that monumental architecture was impossible in that era. Previously, scientists believed that hunter-gatherers did not create such temple complexes. However, Göbekli Tepe convincingly showed that Stone Age people could be capable of much more than had been imagined. If there were monumental structures in Anatolia 12,000 years ago, why could similar phenomena not have taken place in the Nile Valley? Rivers, fertile soils, and an abundance of wildlife made that area naturally attractive to early human communities. Therefore, it is quite plausible that one of the early complex cultures developed here, capable of erecting the Great Sphinx during a period when the Sahara was still green. Later, climatic changes could have weakened and erased that civilization. This hypothesis requires neither aliens nor legendary Atlantises. It only needs acceptance of a simple fact. Our chronology of human civilization may be incomplete. History is much more ancient and complex than. Upon reflection, such a suggestion does not seem radical. After all, a significant part of our past remains unknown. We have information only about those cultures whose traces proved durable enough to survive centuries and millennia. How many civilizations have dissolved into the sands of time without leaving any visible traces? We have no answer to this question, and probably never will. The Sphinx remains silent. Its gaze is directed to the east, where the sun rises every morning, as it was millions of years before humans appeared and will be millions of years after their disappearance. It has witnessed the coming and going of empires, the way sands slowly engulfed cities, the way time wiped out names and faces. It remembers what we have already forgotten and preserves what humanity may never know. In this silence may lie the most important lesson. Not everything can be fully explained, and humility before the unknown often proves the first step on the path to wisdom. Let us now tie together what we have learned and try to form the first, the theory of water erosion, indicates that the monument itself may have been created significantly earlier than the official dates, possibly by several thousand years. The second, the stellar correlation theory, links the Sphinx and the entire Giza complex with the astronomical cycle of precession and proposes as a possible date of creation approximately 10,450 BCE. The third line of reasoning relies on ancient texts and legends that speak of a time before the pharaohs, when Egypt was ruled by gods and demigods, and that seemed to hint at the Sphinx's existence long before the first kings appeared. The fourth theory raises the question of the technical capabilities of ancient craftsmen and suggests that the Sphinx's face could be a reworked part of an earlier sculpture. Finally, the fifth, most radical version attributes the creation of the monument to some Each of these hypotheses is important in its own way and opens different perspectives for understanding what we call the past. Each of the versions under discussion has its strengths and none of them can be definitively proven or disproven on the basis of the data we currently have. Official science takes a cautious, conservative stance. The Sphinx was erected under Khafre around 2500 BCE, and from this point of view, alternative researchers respond differently. In their view, there are too many anomalies to ignore, and it is time not to be afraid to revise the established picture. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere between these extreme assessments. One thing remains indisputable. The Sphinx is one of humanity's greatest mysteries. It has held its place on the Giza Plateau for millennia, and will, in all likelihood, remain there for many millennia after we are gone. A silent guardian of a rapidly fading history, it keeps a secret that we may never fully unravel. Perhaps there is reason in that. A world without mysteries would lose much of its allure. Mysteries feed our curiosity, push us to seek answers, and tenderly nurture dreams of the unknown. The Sphinx serves as a reminder that the universe is broader than our understanding, that the past is deeper than our memory, and that beyond the known, there is always something worth striving for. Allow me now to dwell in more detail on the aspects that were touched on earlier, and to show how multi-layered and complex this mystery is. Let us begin with the geological evidence, for it is often in stone that history is recorded, beyond revision. When Robert Schoch first presented his hypothesis of water erosion at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America in 1991, the reaction of his colleagues was notable. They did not reject his conclusions out of hand. On the contrary, many geologists concluded that the character of the erosion on the body of the Sphinx and on the walls of the surrounding enclosure did indeed correspond more to the action of water than to wind and sand alone. One attendee even remarked that any first-year student could recognize signs of water erosion in the samples provided. And yet, as many have emphasized, the dispute was not about the geology itself, but about what historical conclusions should be drawn from it. Schoch's conclusions sharply conflicted with the chronology of ancient Egypt as established by Egyptologists, and that is precisely why his ideas met fierce resistance. Let's look more closely at what he noticed and why it seemed so provocative. The pit around the Sphinx, cut into the limestone to accommodate the statue, displays a very characteristic profile of surface degradation. The upper layers of limestone are covered with deep vertical grooves and wavy, rounded forms that geologists usually attribute to fluvial, i.e., rain-induced. Such outlines arise when water runs down the walls under gravity, dissolving and washing minerals out of the rock. With prolonged water action, the grooves deepen increasingly, and the longer such a process lasted, the deeper these marks become. Based on the depth and prominence of the erosional forms on the walls of the pit, Schoch concluded that the action of water on these faces of the rock lasted for thousands of years. For contrast, he suggested looking at neighboring monuments of the same historical period on the Giza Plateau, such as the tombs by the pyramids and the valley temples. These structures display a completely different type of deterioration, stratified, mostly horizontal weathering, which is characteristic of the action of wind and sand. The difference between the forms of weathering is so marked that it is clearly visible even in photographs. Why, then, was the Sphinx enclosure subjected to one type of erosion, while nearby monuments were subjected to another? According to Schoch, the only logical explanation is that the Sphinx is older than the surrounding structures and endured a period with a different climate, when precipitation and surface water runoff were considerably more intense. Schoch also pointed out that the erosion in the enclosure is unevenly distributed. The western wall, located closest to Khafre's pyramid, is less affected than the southern and northern walls. This fits the hypothesis that the western face of the enclosure was widened or deepened later during Khafre's reign, while the other parts were carved much earlier. In other words, Khafre may have merely Schoch's critics proposed several alternative explanations for the observed erosion. One of them is linked to the so-called salt weathering effect. The Giza limestone contains soluble salts that, as humidity changes, Schoch, however, stressed that the typical trace of such salt action differs in shape from what we see on the Sphinx. Salt produces loose, flaky, and crumbly surfaces, whereas the sculpture shows deep vertical grooves. Another proposal explained the erosion by nighttime condensation of moisture, or by rare but intense downpours that sometimes occur in the desert. Nevertheless, calculations carried out by researchers showed that the total amount of water that could have come from such sources over a period of 4,500 years would have been clearly insufficient to produce the deep channel. In 2018, geologist Mandy Margolf published a paper in which she tried to explain the erosion profile by uplift of groundwater through capillary processes in the limestone. This hypothesis has a certain appeal, but it doesn't. As a result, the discussion continues, and no consensus has yet been reached on this issue. Notably, in the 30 years since Schoch's ideas appeared, no one has presented a convincing refutation of his arguments. Geological observations still suggest that the Sphinx is older than the times usually assigned to it by official chronologies. Let us now turn to the astronomical evidence and examine it in more detail. The stellar correlation theory of Bauval and Hancock rests on two key observations. First, the placement of the three Great Pyramids of Giza corresponds to the configuration of the three stars of Orion's belt. Second, the axis to which the Sphinx is oriented points toward the rising point of the constellation Leo at roughly the epoch of about 10,450 BC. Let us consider these claims in more detail. Orion's belt is formed by three bright stars, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, which lie almost on a straight line, but with one of them offset relative to the other two. If you look at the Giza plan from above, a similar scene. The correspondence seems striking, but, as skeptics rightly point out, it is far from perfect. The angles and relative distances between the celestial lights and the terrestrial structures do not match exact mathematical calculations. Bauval, in turn, offered a logical explanation for this mismatch. He reminded readers that the apparent positions of stars in the sky change over time because of the precession of the Earth's axis, and therefore the modern map does not necessarily. According to proponents' calculations, roughly 12,000 years ago, around 10,450 BC, the configuration of Orion's belt corresponded much more closely to the layout of the main tombs on the plateau. Besides, at that time, Orion's belt was at the lowest point of its precessional cycle and barely visible above the southern horizon. If the builder's intention really had been to mirror a celestial map on the ground, then, according to proponents, they would have chosen precisely such a symbolically charged moment. The Sphinx's connection with the constellation Leo adds another layer of meaning to this hypothesis. On the morning of the spring equinox of that era, the Sphinx's gaze would have been directed toward the rising constellation Leo in the east. This coincidence is associated with the beginning of the so-called Age of Leo, a phase of the precessional cycle when the vernal equinox point fell in that constellation. In that context, the statue's leonine form, the Sphinx presents itself not only as a monumental image, but also as a kind of epoch marker within the vast cycle of celestial movements. Critics, however, raise an important objection. They point out that the ancient Egyptians left no direct evidence that they knew about precession. The phenomenon is traditionally attributed to the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in the 2nd century BCE. More than 2,000 years. How could the craftsmen of that era orient themselves by something that, according to common opinion, they did not yet know? Proponents answer simply, the absence of explicit written evidence does not prove the absence of the knowledge itself. Many ancient cultures encoded their observations and concepts not in detailed treatises, but in myths, rituals, and architectural forms, leaving traces of understanding in symbolism rather than in explicit explanations. Some researchers even believe that Egyptian myths contain hidden astronomical hints, including to the phenomenon of precession. Thus, the story of Osiris and his resurrection is sometimes read as a metaphor for the cyclical movements of the sky. The figure of Horus, son of Osiris, who avenges his father and restores the former order, is perceived by them as a symbol of the onset of a new era replacing the old one. These interpretations are speculative in nature, yet they open intriguing prospects for interpretation. Critics emphasize that the alignment of the pyramids with Orion's belt may be coincidental. 3 points on a plane can indeed be arranged in infinitely many ways, and among the many such possibilities, outlines resembling one constellation or another. In turn, proponents point to a cultural link. The Egyptians identified the constellation Orion with Osiris, and this constellation occupied an important place in their funerary rituals. Therefore, the suggestion that they might have tried to reproduce its forms on the ground seems less implausible than it might at first appear. Let us now turn to another layer of the Sphinx's mystery, mentioned earlier only briefly, the legends of underground chambers and tunnels. Since ancient times, there have been tales of hidden rooms beneath the statue. Medieval Arab historians wrote of cellars and halls where treasures and ancient records were allegedly kept. In the 20th century, the American clairvoyant Edgar Cayce predicted the discovery of a so-called Hall of Records beneath the Sphinx, a repository of the wisdom of lost Atlantis. These legends and prophecies could be dismissed as imagination if not for one circumstance. Modern investigations have indeed revealed anomalies and voids beneath and around the Sphinx. In 1991, a Japanese team led by Professor Sakudzi Yoshimura from Waseda University carried out seismic surveys on the Giza Plateau. Using ground-penetrating radar, the researchers recorded several anomalies that they interpreted as signs of underground cavities. One of these voids lay beneath the Sphinx's forepaws, another to the south of. These results do not provide definitive answers, but they restore to the legends of secret halls the very element of plausibility that makes the issue worthy of further study. The sizes and shapes of these cavities have not yet been determined with precision, but their existence was recorded with a high degree of confidence. Later in 1996, Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, who for a long time has been the main defender of the official version of the monument's history, acknowledged the presence of subterranean structures, but insisted that their construction belongs to later periods, possibly the Greco-Roman era or even more recent times. He categorically rejected any suggestions of a connection between these cavities and the so-called Hall of Records, or any long-vanished civilization. Nevertheless, questions and doubts continue to grow around these finds. Why are the underground chambers beneath the Sphinx carefully closed off to independent researchers? Why have Egyptian authorities repeatedly forbidden additional geophysical surveys and excavations in the area? Hawass himself justified such restrictions by citing the need to protect the monument and to regulate scientific information. But critics see grounds for suspicion and believe that the authorities may be concealing something capable of altering our understanding. Such a hypothesis is intriguing, but it remains only a conjecture, not proven by facts. Without the ability to enter these underground spaces and conduct independent research, it is impossible to say with confidence what. It is quite possible that these are natural voids in the limestone, of no archaeological value. It is also possible that they were ancient tombs, plundered millennia ago. And of course, one should not forget the hypothesis that something like a repository of knowledge, but these are only conjectures, as long as access to the Sphinx's subterranean chambers remains closed. Let us now turn to another widely discussed mystery of this monument: its face. Official Egyptology asserts that the face of the Sphinx is an image of Pharaoh Khafre. This judgment mainly rests on the proximity of the Sphinx to Khafre's pyramid, and on the supposed resemblance to known sculptural portraits of that ruler. On closer inspection, the resemblance between the Sphinx's face and the depiction of Pharaoh Khafre is far from as unequivocal as it seems at first glance. In 1993, New York police detective Frank Domingo, a specialist in creating composite sketches and facial identification, he applied forensic techniques typically used in recognizing and matching suspects, measuring proportions of features, angles of inclination, ratios of individual facial elements, and the relative positions of features. Such measurements include, for example, the width and height of the facial oval, the relative position of the cheekbones and jawline, as well as the angles at which certain elements converge. The result of the study was unambiguous and not in favor of identification. By all key parameters, the Sphinx's profile does not match the face of Khafre's statue. The proportions differ. Angular relationships are not the same. In other words, the available measurements give a clear signal. The face on the sculpture and the face of the statue belong to different people. Consequently, a natural question arises as to whose face is actually carved on the Sphinx. Researchers have proposed different hypotheses, none claiming finality. Some lean toward Khufu, the father of Khafre and builder of the Great Pyramid. Others point to Djedefre, Khufu's elder son. There are even versions suggesting a female face, possibly Queen Hetepheres, Khufu's mother. All these assumptions rest on a very scant set of data, and therefore cannot be strictly proven. Another notable puzzle is the very disproportion of the Sphinx's head relative to its massive body. If the statue originally had a lion's head, and the head was later reworked into a human likeness, that could explain the reduced size, and the question of who and in what era carried out such reworking remains open. Was it a restoration under Khafre, the decision of an earlier pharaoh, or the work of even more ancient craftsmen? There are no answers to these questions. A separate mystery concerns the Sphinx's nose. It is missing, and many legends surround that fact. One of the best-known versions attributes the destruction of the nose to Napoleon's soldiers, who allegedly used the statue for artillery practice during his Egyptian campaign at the end of the 18th century. This version is widely known and often repeated in accounts of the Sphinx. It is, however, a mistaken notion. Observations and sketches by European travelers who arrived in Egypt at the time of the Napoleonic expedition unequivocally show that the Sphinx's nose was already absent. A 15th century Arab historian, referred to in some sources as al-Makrizi, writes that the Sphinx's nose was destroyed in 1378 by a man named Sa'im al-Dahr, a fanatically minded Muslim who considered the statue a pagan idol and sought its destruction. For this act, he, according to those same accounts, was sentenced to death by local residents who continued to venerate the Sphinx despite having embraced Islam. This version of events seems plausible, although some scholars express doubts and criticize it. In any case, the loss of the nose fundamentally changed. Deprived of that projection, the face became more mysterious and indeterminate. Without the familiar anatomical support, it is harder to reconstruct the original features and make more precise judgments about the ethnic type represented. The absence of the nose complicates attempts to reconstruct expression and character, thereby reinforcing the impression of mystery. In connection with this, there arises another, sharply contested topic directly related to the statue's face. A number of researchers, mainly African and African American, see in the Sphinx's features traits of the Negroid type, a broad nose, full lips, pronounced prognathism. They consider this an argument in favor of the idea. This dispute carries a powerful political ideological charge, and we will not delve into it here. It is important to stress only one thing. The Sphinx's face has been severely damaged by centuries of erosion and acts of vandalism, and therefore drawing essentially everyone sees in it what they want to see. Stepping momentarily away from dry facts, it is worth asking a more general question. Why does the Sphinx so vividly stir people's imagination? Why does this ancient, weathered, and disfigured figure continue to attract millions of visitors from around the world and evoke a desire to unravel its mystery? Perhaps because the Sphinx has ceased to be simply a stone sculpture and has become a symbol of something greater, a sign that at once preserves the past and urges us to seek answers. He appears as a living image of mystery, a symbol of all that in human history has remained unsolved and beyond our full comprehension. One need only look at him, and a sense of the limits of one's own knowledge comes over you, a palpable boundary between what we know and the boundless expanse of what remains to be discovered. The Sphinx reminds us of our place in the universe, of our vulnerable smallness, our being lost in the infinity of time and space, of how we, creatures limited in thought and strength, try to make sense of a world whose... In Greek legends, the Sphinx is depicted as a monster with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head of a woman. She sat on a rock by the road to the city of Thebes and posed a riddle to everyone who passed. Those who could not give the correct answer did not return alive. The riddle ran: what creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? The correct answer is man. In infancy, he crawls on all 4s. In adulthood, he walks on 2 legs. And at first glance, this story may seem far removed from the majestic Egyptian Sphinx. Yet there is a deep connection between them. Both figures embody the idea of a test and a mystery that must be solved to proceed. The Egyptian Sphinx does not speak riddles aloud, but in itself it is a silent questioning addressed to everyone who looks at it. Who made me? When was it done? For what purpose? These questions have hung over the Giza Plateau for millennia, and humanity has still not provided answers. The origin of the word sphinx is also interesting. The Greek word derives from a verb meaning to squeeze or to choke, and in the Greek tales, the Sphinx did indeed, but there is another interpretation. Some scholars see a connection with the Egyptian expression Shesep Ankh, living image. The Egyptians called their Sphinx Shesep Ankhatum, the living image of Atum, and later associated it with the deity Hara. Such names point to the deep religious significance of the Sphinx for the ancient Egyptians. It was perceived not as a mere stone statue, but as a living deity and the eternal guardian of the sacred land. If the Sphinx really held such meaning for the ancient Egyptians, then why did they leave so little information about it? Why do we not possess detailed accounts of its creation, symbolism, and place in rituals? This silence itself has become one of the chief mysteries I have already mentioned. The Egyptians recorded many things: the building of temples, military victories, religious festivals, sometimes even everyday and economic matters. One possible reason is that knowledge about the Sphinx may have been esoteric and intended only for the initiated. In many ancient cultures, sacred information was passed orally from teacher to pupil and deliberately not recorded in writing. Such a practice served as protection. The knowledge was guarded against spreading among those not initiated, preserving its special status and hidden meaning. Perhaps the full history of the Sphinx was known only to the high priests and went with them to their graves. A second explanation is that texts about the Sphinx once existed, but were... Egyptian history includes periods of instability and destruction when temples burned, archives were plundered, and monuments suffered barbaric attacks. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of ancient learning, perished in flames. There is also a third, more radical hypothesis. Perhaps the Egyptians themselves did not know who built the Sphinx or when it was erected. For them, the creature may have been a survival from a much more distant era, a relic left by a civilization that preceded their own. They venerated the Sphinx, made offerings, and restored it after damage, but could not recount its prehistory because that history had been erased by time, long before their genealogical records began. In this sense, the Sphinx remained for them the same enigma it is for us now. To summarize our reflections, it is worth returning to the original official version. The Sphinx is attributed to the reign of Pharaoh Khafre and dated to roughly around 2500 BCE as part of his funerary. This fact serves as the starting point for all subsequent questions and conjectures, but by itself it does not remove the many remaining mysteries. The official version seems convenient and tidy. It fits into the general chronology of ancient Egyptian history and requires no revision. Geological observations point to traces of water erosion on the body of the Sphinx, and such weathering could only have occurred in an era when the Nile and its surroundings experienced heavy rainfall. This, in turn, astronomical data link the entire Giza complex to an era of roughly 10,150 BCE, when Orion's belt occupied the lowest point of its precessional cycle, and the constellation Leo rose on the eastern horizon on the morning of the vernal equinox. Ancient texts and traditions speak of an age of the gods and demigods that existed before the rule of human pharaohs, and these testimonies also suggest that the Sphinx may have existed long before Khafre's time. Analysis of the monument's proportions and form suggests that its head was reworked, possibly from an earlier sculpture of a lion, which in itself points to reworking and, therefore, to an older origin of the structure. If one reconciles all these viewpoints and findings, a picture emerges that is radically different from the official version. It posits that at the very beginning of history, possibly 12,000 years ago or even earlier, in the territory we now call Egypt, there existed a civilization capable of creating. This civilization carved the Sphinx out of living rock, likely in the form of a lion, and oriented it toward the eastern horizon at the rising of the constellation Leo. For unknown reasons, that culture disappeared, leaving behind only. Millennia later, the Egyptians of the Pharaonic era came upon these ancient monuments, appropriated them, partially altered them, and invested them with new meanings. Perhaps it was Khafre or another ruler who gave the Sphinx a human face, built his pyramid beside. The Sphinx itself thus proved to be considerably older than those who made it their own. Finally, it should be made clear that this hypothesis remains unproven. It is based on indirect evidence and logical inference, not on direct archaeological confirmation. Official science rejects this hypothesis, and for good reasons. But a complete refutation is still impossible. A number of inconsistencies and mysterious facts remain unexplained. Anomalies continue to surface, questions do not vanish, and the mystery of the Sphinx still hangs in the air. So the final question with which I want to leave you at the end of our journey is this: what does it change in our understanding of history? If the Sphinx was indeed created roughly 12,000 years ago, many established ideas about the development of human civilization would have to be reconsidered. It would mean that long before the civilizations of Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, long before the emergence of the first city, in that case, the chronology of human history turns out to be much longer and more complex than commonly believed. This suggests that whole epochs and cultural strata lie hidden in the depths of the past, for which we have. And if so, another no less troubling question arises. Why did these civilizations disappear? What caused their demise? Abrupt climate changes, massive natural catastrophes, wars, or epidemics? The scientific record of the Earth preserves evidence of numerous cataclysms, supervolcanic eruptions, impacts of celestial bodies, and sudden climatic shifts. Any of these could have radically altered the face of the planet. Around the end of the last ice age, that is about 12,000 years ago, the world underwent a series of dramatic changes. Ice caps melted, sea levels rose by tens of meters, and coastal lands were submerged. The climate changed rapidly and unpredictably. Many animal species disappeared during that period, including mammoths and saber-toothed cats. Could human civilization have vanished with them? Nearly every people have preserved legends of a universal flood: biblical Noah, the Sumerian Utnapishtim, the Indian Manu, the Greek Deucalion. They all tell of a catastrophic deluge that wiped out. What if these myths are partly based on real events? What if, roughly 12,000 years ago, A global catastrophe occurred that destroyed the advanced cultures of the time and set the survivors back for a long period. In such a scenario, the Sphinx might appear not merely as an ancient monument, but as a stone witness to a lost world, one of the few monuments to survive the catastrophe and carry to us the echo of a body. This idea is at once attractive and disturbing. It attracts by revealing new layers of the past, opening unexplored spaces for investigation and discovery. It disturbs by instilling a sense of the fragility of all we have built, a reminder of how easily human enterprises can collapse. We are proud of our skyscrapers, computers, spaceships, but an inevitable and painful question arises. What if this will remain in 10,000 years? Will these achievements hold their form as the Sphinx still stands? Or will they gradually crumble? The Sphinx is silent. It gives us no direct answers, but by its silence it generates questions. In that, perhaps, lies its essential value. It forces us to think, to doubt, and to seek explanations. It reminds us that the world is full of mysteries, and that the past is not a closed book. There always remains a realm of the unknown yet to be illuminated. In an age when it seems to us that we know almost everything, regardless of who and when created the Sphinx, the mere fact of its existence stands as a majestic reminder of the power of the human spirit. Once, in a distant era, someone saw in a rough limestone outcrop not merely a stone, but a shape that could become something more. That person took up tools and labored, day after day and year after year, and then the work was passed on to following generations until the face of the rock was turned into a marvel. The impulse to create, to leave a mark, and to defy time, that is what distinguishes us as human. The Sphinx became a monument, not only to those who put their labor into it, but to all humanity. To all who have ever dreamed of immortality. We tend to turn our gaze to the past of this monument, trying to untangle its origin. But what if the Sphinx itself is looking more toward the future? Perhaps its gaze, directed east toward the rising sun, carries not a remembrance of what was but a hint of what is yet to come. The ancient Egyptians believed in the cyclical nature of time, in the idea of eternal return, and in that context, the Sphinx's gaze can be imagined as a bridge between the passing and the coming. The sun sets behind the western horizon each day and reappears in the east, as if undergoing a cycle of death and rebirth. The legend of Osiris bears a similar cyclicality. He dies and is resurrected, repeating the ancient notion of endless renewals. Perhaps the Sphinx itself is not merely a stone effigy, but a sign, a kind of warning addressed to us across the centuries. Maybe its creators, having survived a terrible catastrophe, deliberately tried to leave a coded message for posterity. Perhaps the Giza complex is not only a necropolis, but also a sort of time capsule, a repository of information we have yet to fully decipher. Such hypotheses sometimes seem fantastical, but no more incredible than the very existence of the Sphinx. This, at first glance, impossible wonder standing in the... We live in an astonishing age. Modern technologies open access to the past in ways previously unimaginable. Satellite imagery helps detect structures hidden beneath the sands. Ground-penetrating radar probes rock masses and soil, and genetic research allows us to lift the veil on the secrets of ancient mummies. DNA analyses are already changing our understanding of migrations and how human communities formed. Possibly, in the foreseeable future, within the coming years or over the next few decades, new data will emerge that shed light on the Sphinx's mysteries. It may be that underground chambers will eventually be explored, and we will learn what is kept there. Other written materials or artifacts might surface that could revise our ideas about ancient Egyptian history. Or it may happen otherwise. The Sphinx may forever keep its secret, remaining an eternal reminder of the limits of human knowledge. And that, too, has its value. Not everything in the world is meant to be fully comprehended. Some mysteries exist to teach us humility and to remind us how vast and complex. That is what the Sphinx teaches, silently, by its motionless presence. Now, as night slowly descends over the desert and the stars above the Giza Plateau ignite, just as they did many thousands of years ago, the Sphinx continues its silent vigil. Its stone contours, emerge in the moonlight, as if carved from the desert itself. And this visage seems outside of time. It has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of peoples, and how the sand alternately covers and reveals the ancient stones. It is a mute chronicler of history, a keeper of secrets that may never be fully revealed. Close your eyes and imagine you're standing at the foot of the Sphinx by the light of a full moon. The air is cool after the daytime heat. Its scent is dry and subtle, mingled with the aroma of ancient dust and stone. The silence is broken only by the soft rustle of sand carried by the wind, a sound that seems an eternal accompaniment to the monument. Before you rises a colossal figure, carved from a single mass of rock, its face turned to the east, where the sun will rise in a few hours. If you gaze into its eyes, you can make out the glint of stars in their depths, the very celestial lights that were seen by those who fashioned this image many thousands of years ago. In such moments, time loses, past and present intersect and blend into one. You feel an invisible bond with those who stood here before you. From ancient priests to modern travelers, from pharaohs to archaeologists, they all sought the same answers. The Sphinx is silent, but in its silence, if you listen closely, there is the echo of centuries and the voices of long-forgotten ages. In that echo, you hear people who lived, loved, raised buildings, and built dreams. As long as it stands and its stone eyes are turned toward the sunrise, there is hope. Hope that one day we will unravel its mystery. Hope that the past will reveal itself to us in all its fullness. Hope that the human drive for inquiry and truth will not be exhausted, however inconvenient that truth may prove. Thank you for walking beside me on this journey. Good night. May your sleep be warm and peaceful. May the Sphinx guard your dreams as steadfastly as it guarded the dreams of countless generations before you. May the morning bring new questions and fresh discoveries, for that is the meaning of life. It is an eternal quest and a constant awe before the unsolved mysteries of the universe. Until we meet again,